So there's that. And yesterday during the meeting, I had referenced that I was going to send out an email with the Docent Symposium. Now, because we have this follow-up email, there isn't its own Docent Symposium email. So check in the follow-up email for all of the information about the Docent Symposium, where you will be able to sign up.
Okay, and again, other questions for Lori, don't hesitate to contact her after. Everyone might want to go on mute for now. There will be a time for questions at the end of the program. Just a couple of announcements. What were they? Yes, the next Docent Enrichment will be not at its regular time. It will be on Wednesday, March 3rd, and it will be the program you've already heard about, Warren Rosenblum speaking about the lawyers under the Third Reich exhibit. So we'll send out more specific information, but that will be the next enrichment. Also, you should all know by now about the program on February 28th about Carl Lutz. That will be at 11 o'clock, an odd time, but we're actually in 3 time zones from Switzerland to British Columbia. And that was the compromise we came up with. It'll be an opportunity to hear from Carl Lutz's stepdaughter and also from the scholar in British Columbia that wrote about him. So do sign up for that. It should be a really special opportunity. It's also the Reuben Feldman annual lecture. So we've got a very special presentation today. We'll be hearing from Tom White, who's the coordinator of educational outreach for the Cohen Center for Holocaust Studies at Keene State College. He has served as a researcher for Stephen Hooper's documentary film, An American Nurse at War, and as historical consultant for the documentary film, Telling Their Stories, New Hampshire Holocaust Survivors Speak Out. He served on the Diocese and the, wait, I'm losing my text here, sorry. He served on the Diocese of Manchester's Diocesan Ecumenical Commission for Interfaith Relations. He is the co-chair and producer of the Cohen Center's annual Kristallnacht Remembrance. He serves on the board of directors of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. I should say the AHO is where I first had the opportunity to meet and get to know him. He's participated as observer and facilitator in the Global Raphael Lemkin Seminar for Genocide Prevention at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. He received the NEA New Hampshire's Champion of Human and Civil Rights Award in 2009. In 2015, he was named a Peace Ambassador by the Center for Peacebuilding from Bosnia and Herzegovina and serves on the New Hampshire Commission for Holocaust and Genocide Education. A very rich resume. Today, his topic will be Learning from the Past, Facing Difficult History in the US and Germany. Please welcome Tom White.
And thank you for that very kind introduction. It's so good to be with everybody today. And I'm going to be sharing my screen. And what I want to do is spend a little time presenting and then some time, of course, discussing. And I'm going to dive right in. And as we go along, maybe if questions come up, you could write them down or post them on the chat button here. Either way, we'll get to them at the end. This is going to be a comparative look of how we wrestle with very difficult history, having to narrow that down, meaning I think our slave past versus Germany's Holocaust past. We're going to start with a simple comparison here, which I call anger versus reverence. And we've come to terms really over the last 3 or 4 years with the meaning and implication of Confederate statues and the anger that's bringing forth. And it was striking to me that while our memorial landscape in dealing with difficult history is dominated by the perpetrator and the perpetrator narrative, in Germany today, a great contrast. After many years of struggle, the memorial landscape is really dominated by the victim story. And the reverence you see here for that story stands in stark contrast, I think, to what's happening with our lost cause past. So with that as an interesting start, what I want to look at are a few things. How do Germans and Americans encounter their painful histories? How do we use history? Do we use it to reinforce a position, to reduce history, to justify our point of view? Or do we use it like the stumbling stones here, allowing us to trip over history, to challenge ourselves, to warn ourselves about what history means? And I think we have to respond not just to what's in front of us, which we will bring up today, but also what is behind us. And in so doing, I'm not interested so much in villainizing as I am in finding common ground in which we can build something better. And so we begin with the concept of heritage, a very loaded word in American conversation. And the lie span, I want to frame this, I think, in the context of the big lie, and how once white supremacists and white nationalists use a big lie for a variety of reasons, it has a very long lifespan. So I'd like to start off, first of all, with the idea that white supremacist and white nationalist leaders lie because it benefits them, at least them, in the short term. But those who happen to follow their particular big lie, it devastates them in the long term. White nationalism is rooted in trauma and fear. And when I encounter anybody who, of course, is espousing a fear-held belief, I want to find out what trauma they're dealing with. And that could be a common starting ground. And I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. White nationalism, as we know, brings loss and devastation. And so I'm going to tie that together by looking at 3 big lies. The first big lie I want to focus on was in our country in 1861, where President Lincoln had won the election, and Southern aristocratic landowners of the large plantations especially did not want to recognize the results of that election and spun a lie. It was a lie that they had really been warned about a couple of years earlier, that they were losing their position, that indeed slavery itself was no longer going to hold the South together. And with that, they played their great fear card. And they told Southerners that President Lincoln's goal was to free all the slaves and raise them above you, which the Republican platform of 1861 expressively said they weren't going to do. It certainly became what the war was about by 1863, but indeed it was a lie in 1861. And so the lie was, Lincoln will raise the black men above you, so defend yourselves. Those who took up the call to arms ended up with a devastated country, the Confederacy. The second big lie I'd like to look at is what happened after the First World War. Note, both of these come out of trauma. And for 1918, of course, the great lie, rather than claim the truth, which was that German generals had lost the war, they indeed blamed somebody else. The great lie that we were stabbed in the back by the Jews. Now, this lie, you'll notice, is many years before Hitler comes to power in 1933. It has a very long life, and who knows where that lie will spawn its end result. Although 18,000 German Jews received the Iron Cross in the First World War, 12,000 died at the front, facts and truth don't matter once you take a position of believing a white supremacist lie. And of course, the end result, as we know, was devastation of Germany. I think the third big lie that's contemporary that we're dealing with now is what's happening in our country when white nationalists claim that the election was stolen. And what they mean by that in their code language is that Black people were allowed to vote. If you take away the Black vote, clearly the election results would have been different. And so Take Our Country Back has a resonant ring, and I would argue is going to have a long life. So denial is, of course, part and process of the whole process of atrocity. Denial happens before, it happens during. One thinks of Nazi euphemisms of special treatment, the denial that's inherent in the activity itself, and the denial that follows. And I think it's trauma and fear that force people into these extreme either or positions. These binaries of right versus wrong, it's out of trauma, and trauma carries through the generations. It skews how you read things, how you feel things, how you understand and experience things. And once one starts to talk about I'm right and you're wrong, it will shut down all kinds of conversation, and facts mean nothing. All that matters is the position you're taking in opposed to somebody or something else. And then, of course, what is not talked about, and we find this in our classrooms all the time, students are afraid to speak because someone's going to shut them down or claim they don't want to hear their story. And so what is not talked about, of course, is acted upon, which is why I think education is so important, that we can talk about these issues. So how do we go forward? How do we recognize diverse histories and not feel threatened in our own narrative? So I raised the curtain on this by using this holding slide, and I think for me it's kind of symbolic. I really believe truly that education makes a huge difference, and that's the work you all do as well. And so a lot of the work we do is very dark. Here we are in winter, the frozen life, and yet I've used this picture to show life emerging in the springtime. And I really believe that's what education does. It allows us to thaw whatever freezes us apart from each other, right? And allow us to have some kind of hope of what we can build. So that's my sort of symbolic background to this as we compare US and Nazi racism, structural racism. So how did US racism, systemic racism, influence the Nazis? I'm going to begin with an incident that took place in Florida at Christmas time in 1943. Willie James Howard was a 15-year-old only child of a Black family. He was the first person to graduate from high school and was very excited that he had been hired for a new job. And in his teenage excitement, he decided to write cards to everybody at work and introduce himself. And he made a huge mistake, though he didn't know it at the time. He had a crush, it looks like, on a teenage white girl who also worked there. And he wrote her a kind card about how he couldn't wait to get to know her more. That was his death sentence, because on January 2nd, a mob showed up at his house, hogtied him, teenage boy, forced him to jump in the river, as his father had to watch his son drown with a gun pointed at his head. A local grand jury refused to indict the killers, and federal prosecutors refused to intervene. In 1944, the next year, the concentration camps are being liberated in Europe. And the question on everybody's mind was, what do you do with Hitler after the war? And so the essay contest with that title was won by a 16-year-old Black student in Columbus, Ohio, who won the essay contest by responding with a single sentence. What do you do with Hitler after the war? She wrote, put him in black skin and let him live the rest of his life in America. I find that devastating. And here, a colleague of ours has done a lot of work with Black newspapers in the South during the Second World War, often ignored. And of course, spouting a similar warning and narrative here. If Hitler came to Mississippi, he'd be greeted as a hero by people like Senator Bilbo and others who you may be familiar with. So this is a real problem, obviously, that we're very aware of and growing more aware of, but the Nazis themselves were very aware of this situation. And Hitler, in September of 1933, sends a memo to the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, so that, of course, Prussia being run by Goering at the time, to create Jewish and race laws. And of course, right away, a committee was formed of experts, and they began to figure out where are we going to learn how to create laws that will go through our legal system that will hold up. And of course, the obvious place to do research was the United States. And so they went to the Jim Crow South, and a study mission, if you would. They met experts in the South. They met a whole slew of people, and they were very impressed. And they very much thought this is maybe where we want to go in Germany, but they had real hesitations. Now, the context here, of course, is important. It's September of 33. Hitler has not yet secured total power. There are still, if you would call this, moderates, conservatives, maybe who are not Nazified, but are conservative or ultra-conservative, who are putting the brakes on some of these sort of extreme initiatives. And so the conclusion of the study in that context at that time was Jim Crow is too radical for Nazi Germany. Jim Crow is too radical for Nazi Germany, at least in 1933. However, in studying the Deep South, they recognized some things that they really liked. Things like the American institution of lynching, which they will bring back and introduce into the concentration camp network. They reject things that seem way too radical to them. The idea that in America, if you had one drop of black blood anywhere in your past, you were therefore black. They couldn't imagine trying to figure out how to do that to Jews in Germany. And so to them, that was too radical, not because they disagreed with it, because it was simply impractical. However, while they're studying in the US, and this had happened previous to the study trip as well, they knew that America had other things to teach about race and race law and race experience. Hitler himself in 1928 had admired how Americans gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage. As the Nazis formed their Lebensraum program of living space in the East, which is tied, of course, to war and expansion, it was being modeled and inspired by the American experience in the West. At least Hitler's imagination about what he was reading about the West. And so the Lebensraum program referenced the wild East. And those reservations would be concentration camps. And so this is fueling Hitler's imagination. But I think most importantly is what had happened long before the Nazis that will really now be reinforced by this study trip. As these people realized that Jim Crow is impractical at this time, there are other things that were much more useful. And this, of course, is the eugenics program in the US. Here's a eugenics certificate here, very famous on many of the eugenics books that we now look at. But Hitler himself is very interested in the US. He's interested because he thinks the United States, with its significant German population, is a model for the world. They have done race law. They have identified races as evil and undesirable. They have become a great world power. And he believes that the US is being held back because they won't go far enough in their racial mission. So literally, he thinks he can do better. And he wants those lawyers and team of his to study US eugenics laws to see how he can then do better with them in Germany. The first sterilization law ever was from Indiana in 1907, and it was used on disabled people. And so the German researchers begin to shift their focus from Jim Crow into eugenics, and especially the eugenics approach in America, which was to use sterilization as a punishment for crime, which led them to the Human Betterment Foundation of California, the leading eugenics organization at the time. And as I studied them, California at the time was the leading sterilization state. There are 24 states involved in sterilization on a much lower level than what the Nazis wanted to do. But what they learned by looking at the Human Betterment Foundation is how they got professionals involved, doctors, how they spread the word about what they were doing through propaganda. As they told the Germans, they said, you know, we've told everybody about this and justified it, and those who receive our propaganda are on board. How true a statement that was is unclear. But for the Germans and people like Goebbels, that meant what we have to do is tell people why we're going to do this, and that will make it effective. They're learning all this from their study of California. On June 5th, 1934, a meeting is held, and Hitler's Minister of Justice, Roland Freisler, chairs the meeting to craft what will later become the Nuremberg Laws. They begin the meeting by discussing what they've learned about US race law. And what have they learned? A poster from 1916. World War I gives eugenicists the ability to create the research that they want that will sort of tell the story that they want. And you have posters like this coming out, or even the picture here of the Better Babies Contest winners of 1934 in America. And even my previous boss, he remembers he was and this is, I think, the 50s, a contest for the most Aryan-looking baby. And this is in America, of course. So when we see the Nuremberg Law charts, they're going to look very similar because, of course, this is cross-pollination. These are experts who are traveling back and forth, talking to each other. And now the Nazis want to put this in place on a large scale. So let's get more specific about the impact of US eugenics and racial policy on Hitler and the Nazis. And again, it's timely because at this stage of the game, and I call this sort of the post-Civil War Confederates find allies. Reconstruction has ended in 1877. And by the way, I think that's a really stark difference. Denazification in Germany is ongoing since 1945, which has led them to the stumbling stone memorial of thinking about the victims. We have less than a decade, and then we bury it all. And the people who had caused the Civil War are then put back in power. They're elected to Congress, and they come into Congress and try to find a new power base. The power base that worked before was the great race lie. And so in California, the Chinese have built our railway from East Coast to West and connected us, are now unemployed. And there are race riots taking place in California. Immediately, an opportunity is seen by these former Confederates to find allies. And we have Chinese, of course, being targeted, forced to live in ghettos or Chinatowns to protect themselves. And immediately, Southern Democrats reach out, if you would, to people in California. By 1882, they've passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. By 1917, World War I approaching, they have passed the Asiatic Barred Zone. And I could be wrong, but if memory serves right, what is the island there in San Francisco that becomes the prison? Is Alcatraz. It may have been one of those sites like in Ellis Island or the West Coast that gets, of course, transformed into something quite different. So vast sections of Asia are not allowed immigration visas. But I think what's interesting here is how it's now tied to eugenics experts. Because what they say is not just Asians are barred, but people who are undesirable, to be banned alongside of homosexuals and idiots. These are eugenics concepts. By 1921 and 24, two US immigration acts have now excluded immigrants from undesirable races. Indeed, they even reference that they want to attract Aryan races to the United States. This is of course, 1924 is the Immigration Act that creates the quota. That, of course, will keep many Jews out from Europe from coming into the United States. That immigration law is on the books until the 1960s and President Johnson. The co-sponsor of the 1924 bill, working with eugenicists, was Representative Albert Johnson, who's a member of the KKK. The images you have on the right is, let's build a wall to keep the Chinese out. Down below is a cartoon about the 1921 Immigration Act, which is trying to restrict immigrants from Europe and seen as too liberal by 1924. And so they make it even more strict. But when I hear build walls, keep those undesirables out, I go to this quote from Georgia Governor Clifford Walker, who says, "I would build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven, against the admission of a single one of those Southern Europeans who never thought or spoke the language of democracy." He says that to support the Immigration Act of 1924, and he says it to the convocation to a KKK rally. So the KKK has a huge role to play in this, of course, feeding into all of this hysteria. But I want you to notice their slogan. This is a coin from 1922, and their slogan is America First. So when you hear America First, build walls to keep the undesirables out, you're speaking the code language of white supremacy in the United States. It's then reinforced by eugenicists who will then give justification for these race-based immigration laws that begin in earnest after the Civil War. Now, for Hitler, he is paying close attention to all of this. And in Mein Kampf, he even notes that the US divides its inhabitants into three categories. And I want you to remember the first two specifically. And he says, The US has effectively created citizens, that's wonderful, mostly white people. And then there are nationals in the US. These are Blacks and indigenous people who are citizens often, but don't have full rights. And he admires that. And then he says even going further, they have non-citizen nationals. As the US empire expands with the Spanish-American War, now we have brown people coming in. And of course, places like Puerto Rico are still not states, even though by our Constitution they should be. And so he admires how American lawmakers have skirted the rules and have created 3 separate categories. Isn't that something I want to achieve? And so he admires how immigration law has kept undesirables out of the United States. In 1928, he is sort of editing his 2nd volume of Mein Kampf, which is unpublished. And in it, he directly references the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 24 as model legislation that he hopes to build upon and add to the Nazi Party platform. So as we're about to get to Nazi race law, I have to go to my neck of the woods first, which is Vermont, which approves its sterilization law in 1931, 2 years before Hitler comes to power. It's the 29th state to do so. So you can see this is a growing and lively expansion of eugenics policies. Sterilizes approximately 200 people, which of course the Nazis would see as very minor. And I wish I wasn't joking when I said this, but these were mostly French-Canadian lumberjacks and Native American people, mostly Abenaki Indian tribe, to preserve the sort of Protestant white base of Vermont. I mentioned that first because here's a 1930s Nazi propaganda poster that is talking about we are not alone, setting the ground, if you would, what they are going to be learning from the Human Betterment Foundation about propaganda, about we're not extreme here, we're actually in the mainstream. And they point out countries on the left that are supporting eugenics and sterilization, and top of the list is the United States. And so we get to Nazi race law, July 14th, 1933, the law for preventing hereditary ill progeny. The date is important. The Nazis are positioning themselves as an anti-Enlightenment party against the values of the French Revolution of July 14th, Bastille Day, about liberty, equality, and brotherhood, all these enlightened values of progress and hope. And so they're positioning themselves as opposed to that, and their scientific justification is eugenics. And so this, of course, would prevent ill and what government agencies would describe as handicapped from having children. But the law itself uses some of the precedents from the California sterilization laws. And some US newspapers pick up on this right away. And they note that the mass scale of the Nazi policy dwarfs what we do in America, and that Hitlerites themselves would apply the law immediately to Jews and political opponents. So the obviousness is here right from the very beginning. But what's interesting is the American eugenics community, who views all of this, the American Eugenics Society, as progress, as the logical development of what they've been working on. And they would argue that Germany's best specialists are on board. This is not something hasty that Hitler is making up, but it's scientific and progressive. And they go on to say that Hitler's sterilization policy will demonstrates his great courage, his statesmanship. So they see this as a real positive. Positive advancements against what? Criminal activity, all kinds of crimes that are all based in their mind on eugenics and on race. A few years later, we get to the Nuremberg Laws. And of course, interestingly enough, before the Nuremberg rally in September of 35, Hitler had promised to make a huge foreign policy announcement. And part of that was he was going to say that Jews or non-Aryans couldn't fly the Nazi flag. And he realized himself that that was going to kind of fall rather flat. And things were all coming together at the right time. And he said, no, I want to make race law announcements now. Finalize race law for me. And so they do. And as they're trying to figure out the big hurdle they were trying to figure out, new data comes in that's going to help them. So the final piece that will allow the Nuremberg Laws to come together was the question about how to criminalize intermarriage. There are almost no legal precedents anywhere in the world, but the US had them. And the US had anti-miscegenation laws in 30 states. And as the researchers look at those, they come to 2 states, North Carolina and Texas, whose laws were vague enough to say, If people associate with Black people, that's enough. You don't even have to be married. Well, for the Nazis, this was the golden ticket, because many Jews, of course, how would you identify them? They'd assimilated, they were German, they didn't have a different color. And so what you could do is someone would hang around with a Jew. You could therefore use these justifications to, of course, separate them, which is what the Nuremberg Laws do. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of their citizenship by distinguishing between Reich citizens, those with the proper Aryan German blood, and where did this word come from? Nationals. The law to protect German blood and German honor forbids intermarriage with Jews. Now, literally what happens here when Germans are made, or Jews here are made nationals, it means they are still citizens, but they're like Black Americans. They don't have full rights. They have the right to get a passport, which is good because we want to deport them. That was, of course, the early stages here to force Jews to leave Germany. I call this Germany First. This is a eugenics poster promoting the law to protect German blood and honor. And you're going to see it's a wall around Germany. And the idea was maintaining the purity of blood ensures the survival of the German people. They're going to do it alone, of course, and eugenics is going to be the key to move forward. What's also interesting for me, and you're looking at German propaganda promoting the program, is how they use the American experience to justify it. So one of the interesting stories here is of Jack Johnson, who was invited to fight what was known at the time as the Great White Hope, Jim Jeffries, in a boxing match on July 4th. And the sort of white supremacists, either subconsciously or consciously, wanted that boxing match to turn out a certain way, and it didn't when Jack Johnson won. Johnson, of course, has a really hard time after that because of a number of reasons. He goes to Paris, he gets married to a white woman, he is wealthy, he's successful, he's everything a white supremacist in America detested. And so by US law, because he was married to a white woman, it probably didn't help that she was French as well, he was barred from entering the US. This was used in Nazi propaganda to justify the laws they were passing at Nuremberg. If the Americans can do this to a guy like Jack Johnson, who are we not to? And so confronting the past. I'm going to start after the First World War, 1919, with this image here of a lynching. This is in Omaha, and the context is that as World War I began, the first people who volunteered to fight were Black Americans. And the Harlem Hellfighters come to mind, amongst others. And they had the distinct problem of going to the front and doing very well, winning medals of honor, being on the front page of all the newspapers as a recruitment tool to get Americans to volunteer for the war. But for those with white supremacist leanings, this was an absolute insult. And so when these soldiers came home, they had to be put back in their place. And so part of the Omaha race riots was to murder those Black soldiers who had gotten too big for themselves by fighting for freedom. And so this is the end result. When I look at that, coming to mind are those people who are staring at the cameraman, who want to be seen committing murder, because for them, it was not at all murder, it was just and right. As a contrast, I go to 1945. Eisenhower at the Ordre sub camp, where he comes upon bodies being burned on railway lines. The behavior is the same, whether it be German white supremacists or American white supremacists. How they target and destroy their enemy is similar. Of course, as you know, Patton is with him. Patton vomits here, and they look at this. And of course, Eisenhower decides he needs these photographs circulated throughout the theater. He gives GIs copies, says to bring them home, because I think he recognized that this is not a German problem. This is a human problem, and we Americans have to face that problem as well. And he says, we are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against. And that fight, of course, is ongoing through our time today. That first sentence is also a reference, I think, to isolationism. Isolationists who, in many cases, went pro-fascist and were anti-Semitic. This is a warning about that as well. But even in framing it this way, I think there's a problem. Because if I just left it at this, we can all reject extreme actions by very bad people and say never again. But I think in so doing, we miss our own responsibility, and we miss that this was a process, not an event. That there were many times intervened personally and other ways to stop this from happening. So in confronting the past, I think we also have to confront not just the atrocity itself, but all the things that led up to those choices and behaviors. And now finally, we're starting to have our first real honest encounter with a very difficult past. And many you are familiar, of course, with what we'll call the Lynching Museum, but the U.S. National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, and good Southerners have this memorial. And part of the memorial here is when you walk in, you look up and see these pillars hanging down, and it's the name and place and date of a lynching. And so literally history weighs down upon you symbolically of a lynching. What's interesting for me is this whole monument was inspired when the architect had traveled to Berlin and he'd seen Germany's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. And he looked at those villages and towns symbolized here by the granite on the ground. And he said, what if I flip that over and bring that home and talk about lynching? And so for me, it's interesting all these years later that as Americans helped inspire German race policy in the 30s, here we are all these years later, and the Germans are helping inform us on how we approach difficult history. So what can we learn in this encounter? I think we have to remember process and outcome, and I think we have to recognize and not deny what we're facing today. And so growing white nationalism, building upon white supremacy, my distinction, and it's for my own psychological construct, is for me, white supremacy is the structural racism that has existed in the United States. White nationalism is now the international movement, which really is rooted in Europe, to basically spread white supremacy. And so in many ways, white nationalism is sort of the holding bit, and they franchise out their hatred into countries. And in our country, the franchise are the white supremacists. So here, the first picture is of Matthew Heimbach holding this flag, which you may or not have noticed before. But this is a symbol of the Romanian Iron Guard, the fascists who participated in the Holocaust. And here's an American holding this up, and you'll note too the Confederate flag, of course, a symbol of hate and slavery together with it. And so combining American white supremacists with this international symbol of race hatred. That's important because Heimbach is one of the organizers of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where an American citizen was murdered, and the president said these were decent people. The shooter of the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue, and folks we know there as well, had met with Heimbach before. The Christchurch, New Zealand shooter of the mosque had also used symbols popularized by Heimbach. So you have, yes, it gets farmed out, but then it returns as well and informs other hateful actions. White nationalists are relatively few in number, very loud, of course, and visible. But if you were to survey Americans and ask them specifics about, do you believe in interracial marriage? There's much more sympathy for them. And their code words to get people on their side and the fear they try to espouse, the terms you'll hear are globalism. And of course, that has a real anti-Semitic tinge. You'll often see sort of anti-globalism marches tied in with anti-Semitism. Hollywood as being, again, this liberal bastion of hate. Fake news, which of course comes out of Nazi Germany. This was Goebbels in the 1930s talking about Langenpresse, trying to vilify the Munich press and others. All lives matter, to escape the specificity of Black Lives Matter and having to confront that, and to also claim victimhood status, which is a key for white supremacy. Antifa as looters, the left, and white genocide. White genocide is fairly common. This is what motivates people into self-defense. And they believe that this is organized by Jews and their policies to promote racial mixing, homosexuality, and abortion as a ways to undermine the white race. which of course rings bells for many of us because in 1936, Himmler begins to unify the German police forces by creating the Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion. And this, of course, would allow the Germans to really organize on a national scale a police force roundup. How do you do that? How do you learn that? It came out of that particular office. And now very difficult to get, of course, thank goodness, because we're learning things here. But the Turner Diaries is really the Bible, if you would, of the white supremacist movement in the US. And it depicts the overthrow of the US government, nuclear conflagration, race war, and ultimate extermination of enemies of the white race and these undesirable racial elements among the remaining population, many of which are clearly stated as being Jews. So I think that's what we saw on January 6th. This is a combining of many different people, a combination of white supremacist movement rooted in structural racism in our country, international anti-Semitism, and here you have the Proud Boys with their symbol of this, of course, which is not the OK symbol, but the W for white supremacy. And that's, of course, the structural racism, but it's also combined with 6 million Jews were not enough. And so you're combining, again, structural racist with international anti-Semitism. And so when we look at what happened on January 6th, and we see, of course, clear symbols on the upper left of our own racial past of lynching, we have to also connect the dots a little bit more, because this comes right out of the Turner Diaries as well. The Turner Diaries depict the day of the rope, when betrayers of the race will be lynched, and there will be a war to the death with the Jew. And so you have this, again, combination of white supremacy with anti-Semitism and an attack. The picture just below that, of course, with the fellow with the ties in his hand, brings back images of blacks being tied up and thrown into the river in 1943. On the upper right, a QAnon supporter, and I don't have time to really spend time with QAnon. I do a whole separate presentation on them. For those who are familiar with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, this is its reemergence. So they believe, like the protocols would talk about, and how the Nazis would use this, of course, is that the enemy are sexual predators. You might be familiar with how the Nazis vilified Jewish doctors by labeling them as sexual predators. And so these people are attracted to this to defend in their trauma, this attack on innocent children. And here she holds, save our children, really believing that those in power are out in some kind of cabal against children. But that's the protocols in action. On the other side, something else happened here that day, and we've heard it. We've heard congressmen from both sides of the aisle, congresspeople, in terror for their lives that day. And horrific as that is, it also, I think, opens up an opportunity, because white nationalism, anti-Semitism comes from a place of fear. But here is a fear that unifies, that they themselves were threatened. And what can that offer us? And this is where I'd like to shift and sort of wind it up by saying, in our country, we have all kinds of people who are used to being afraid and being targeted, and have decided how to deal with that. And so I want to quote Martin Luther King. The limitation of riots, moral questions aside, is that they cannot win, and their participants know that. Hence, rioting is not revolutionary, but reactionary, because it invites defeat. It involves an emotional catharsis, but it must be followed by a sense of futility. We've learned our lessons. And so the lessons here, I think, as we look at how we try to move forward, is that, and someone brought this up in a class I did last week, and they said, what was different about America? I said, what versus Nazi Germany? We had a very large minority that could fight back. And I thought about that for a while, and it's very interesting. There's a lot there in my mind that's playing around. But let me look at our minorities and how they fought back against injustice. And I'm going to quote, of course, Martin Luther King, talking about how does one deal with fear, the fear of being killed, murdered, threatened, and under assault and attack. Normal fear protects us. Abnormal fear paralyzes us. Normal fear motivates us to improve our individual and collective welfare. Abnormal fear constantly poisons and distorts our inner lives. Our problem is not to be rid of fear, but rather to harness and master it And so as an American, what I want to do, especially in my position as a white male from New England, I find great lessons in our minorities who were targeted and chose to fight for the Republic. And so the Navajo Code Talkers, of course, their families on reservations as American nationals. Or the most decorated combat unit of the Second World War, the Nisei Regiment, whose parents are in American concentration camps. And yet, look at their achievements here. Because even though they are afraid, even though they're persecuted and targeted, they held on to the fabric of what the American dream can mean for oppressed peoples. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action, said Martin Luther King. And so as we wrap this up, what does progress look like for all of us in our jobs, right? We hope nothing happens and then we've somehow succeeded, but I think it's beyond that. I think that something does happen. And I want to start, just because I get to do this, talking about my own hometown. Here in Keene a few years ago, we had a project called by the Wall Dogs, a group of people who come in and they're muralists, and they work with the town and they say, what do you want to remember? We want to put murals all over the town. One of the memories that's common in Keene is the memory of Jonathan Daniels. And if you've not heard of him, I hope this will be a wonderful introduction. John was a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He's from Keene. He became a seminarian for the Episcopal Church, and he heard Martin Luther King's call to go to the South to help. And he did. He went to Alabama, not on a parachute to rescue anybody, but to work with people and say, how can I be of help? And he started to register Black voters. He was then arrested and put in this horrible jail cell, released a little while later to a very quiet town where a little Black girl and he walked across the street. He wanted to buy her a soda. In the doorway stood a white sheriff, and he leveled his shotgun and fired. John jumped in front of the shotgun blast and was killed instantly, but saved the life of 17-year-old Ruby Sales. I tell you that story because this is one of the murals in Keene about John. And John is only one of two Americans who are saints in the Anglican Church. And when my family got to travel to Canterbury Cathedral, we got to see how they remembered him in England. And I thought, isn't that interesting how here in Canterbury Cathedral, they remember these kind of Americans who would risk it all to build a better future. But in Keene also, in that same mural project, is a story not quite as good. Well, that's not even a good story. But in this case, Dr. Johnson, who was a Black man passing himself off as white. Indeed, a movie is made about this called Lost Boundaries. And in this particular story, he tries to join the Navy in the Second World War and is outed as being Black. And here in Keene, of course, you can imagine there were those who supported him and those who did not. We tell that story as well. New England, of course, decimated the indigenous people. And so one of the murals is for the Abenaki tribes, and there are other tribes here as well. Even more interesting for me is the last sort of diamond part of the panel here, was left blank until the Abenaki themselves could fill in that last spot, which indeed they did, and added their own mural to the city's mural. New Hampshire has now passed mandatory Holocaust and Genocide Education. I served on that commission, as Dan had mentioned. Here we're now recognizing Black veterans of the Second World War who couldn't even buy a home in Levittown after the war. Or here the Tuskegee Airmen. Thank goodness the Red Tail P-51 pilots who flew over Europe and protected our bomber crews. Virginia saying we are going to reject the lost cause lies of Lee and all that, and honor other Southerners who have quite a different history to tell. Here in Georgia, taking account of the lynchings that took place in their town and taking responsibility for them. The attack on the Pittsburgh synagogue. The first people who showed up was the Muslim community of Pittsburgh, who not only surrounded the synagogue and said they protect it for as long as needed, but they also raised $200,000 from their own families to help out the Jewish community in Pittsburgh. And if you haven't heard this one of my favorite ones, of course, John Lewis, who was vilified in the previous administration. They are now working on a bipartisan project to have his statue replace that of a Confederate at the Georgia State Capitol. And so the history of America is about minorities, telling us how to fight for freedom and build a better republic. And Martin Luther King said, let us be those creative dissenters who will call our beloved nation to a higher destiny, to a new plateau of compassion, to a more noble expression of humanity. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the dark and shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morals, and strength without sight. And finally, and I do believe this, the moral arc of the universe bends at the elbow of justice. And that only happens if people like you and I work toward that end. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. So thank you. And then I would love to hear your thoughts and your questions. And I just appreciate having time to spend with you.
Thank you, Tom. And there is time for questions. We're not a huge group, so if you just want to chime in and be aware of the other people chiming, let's take the first question.
I have a question, Tom. How did you get interested in this? What is your path through academia or your career path that led you into this area of history?
It's Mark, a very fair question, and one I'm really uncomfortable answering. Only for the reason of, look, to be honest and frank, I have lived a very easy, good, wonderful life. I've never faced persecution. And I would hate to sort of say, oh, look at these wonderful things that led me to this particular path. So let me just put it this way. I'm going to quote our students. We have an undergraduate major, Holocaust Genocide Studies, and they succinctly put it this way: it found me. So somehow along the way, it found me, and here I am. And I really love your question, but I'm uncomfortable answering it. And
no, it was a good answer. It's I just, different people find a passion for an area of history or a cause, and it's just interesting to know what leads us to those passions. So it found you.
I wish there are obvious triggers too, and strangely of all things, in the 1970s as a kid, the Holocaust miniseries on NBC struck me. In hindsight, we look back on that and say, well, it wasn't the best production. But something about that struck me as a kid, and maybe that was a starting point. Who knows? But thank you for that. They
say that was a big event in Germans' awareness. A certain generation of Germans became aware because of that series.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Nancy. Thank you for everything, and also showing how we can chip away at some of this individually. But are you optimistic? And if so, how do you stay that way? Because speaking for myself and others I know, it's been hard in recent years, and especially in recent months. So what else can we do, and do you have hope?
So Nancy, I share that with you, but I also share it out of the humility of not yet feeling persecution. I've been able to say what I have to different audiences. I have a mixture of fear and hope. And I'm going to give you a quick story about that, which is I was in a high school class a week or so ago. And this was a low level class, which translates into lower income class. They don't have as much, opportunity. And I was presenting on QAnon and anti-Semitism. And as I presented on that in the background, this kid started yelling, "Proud Boys rule, Proud Boys rule." And at that moment, my anger that grew up dissipated really quickly, because what I try to teach is someone is coming from a place of real hurt when they embrace that kind of feeling. And so I stopped, and thank goodness for our screen here in Zoom, and I just said, "Hey, John," or whatever his name was. I said, "That's a really interesting point of view. Tell me why you feel that way." And he went on, and we had this conversation. It was very interesting. And as we were conversing, another kid said, "And yeah, it's all true because President Biden is a pedophile," which is part of the QAnon conspiracy nonsense. And I said, "Well, that's really interesting, Mark," or whoever it was. I said, "How do you know that?" He says, "Well, I saw this picture online." I said, "It's fat." And I just so happened to have a picture in case this came up, and I showed it. He goes, "That's the one. You have it too. See how I said, yes, do you know the context of this photograph, what the photograph is? He says, yeah, it's him. I said, no, this is his son's funeral. And that's his granddaughter. And every grandfather has the right to comfort his granddaughter at her father's funeral. At that moment, that kid, he immediately said, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. I should never have posted that. I'm really, really sorry. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, but I want you to tell me, the source that you found that. And I'm really sorry that you did post that, but, I understand why, but can you give me your sources that you're using? He says, absolutely. I heard him typing. And he's going to give you. Now, what I never got anything from him. What I suspect happened was, as he pulled up all the sites, it's all the ones I'd already mentioned. And he had an awakening. So I really believe this generation is teaching us to really recognize stuff we've been avoiding. Black Lives Matter. Why are we persecuting people because they're homosexual? These are questions that this generation is saying, this makes no sense to us. That doesn't mean they're all perfect. That doesn't mean they don't have hatred. We see that being used. But I really see education and technology as a real hopeful path forward. And the work we've all done, even though it's being criticized, it hasn't done enough, has created an incredible foundation that we're all building upon in presentations like today. So I have this mixture of reality, of fear. A colleague of mine, Jim Waller, who assesses countries en route to genocide. It's a model that the UN uses and others. The US has a lot of warning signs right now for the first time. But at the same time, Georgia held, thank God. And things have held, and now the work begins, I think. So I'm not sure if that's the right or good answer, but I have a mixture of fear, soberness, but also hope.
I don't know if you heard, and others, I'll just add this because it just made me think of it when you were mentioning something just now. You've probably heard, I don't know, it was QAnon and all these kind of groups. There's a lot of stuff going on about the fact that the Biden's marriage is kind of a fake and it's not whatever, disparaging things. And somebody, a well-known person from Fox News, whose name I won't use, was going on and on about this. And one of the Biden's granddaughters may have been the one, because it was, her father who, no, it wasn't her father. It was her father who died. Anyway, doesn't matter. But anyway, she had, I thought, a great answer to that. And it was, will somebody please give this man a hug?
I love that. And I think that's the right approach, because if we vilify these people, that all of them are like this, right? Then there's no hope at all. But I think that gives us great hope. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that, QAnon was spurned really by a large part by the epidemic and by the pandemic. And I remember a few years ago, people saying, do you think this will come back? The protocols said, if we have a pandemic, it's coming back. Had the pandemic, it came back, all the stuff was in place. But after that, what has happened since? QAnon has begun to dissipate. Still important, it's still lethal. The approval rating for the president has gone up by those who previously had voted for the other party. And that's fine. So I think there are some hopeful signs here, and maybe we've avoided something darker, but it forces us now to look at those very ugly things that created this. And I love your story. What a wonderful story.
Go ahead, because you have your hand.
So I was wondering, thank you, by the way, for your presentation, which is just enormously impactful and so important. And it gives me great hope to know you're out there teaching and listening.
All of us are. We all are, right?
So could you please speak to Marjorie Taylor Greene? Obviously, she embraces horrific anti-Semitism, and people joke about the Jewish space laser, but her ideas are truly dangerous. And that obviously, as you have shown, has existed for decades and centuries and eons. But the fact that she's now a congresswoman, and the fact that over 100 members of Congress stood and applauded her and seemed to embrace and endorse and support her is terrifying to me. Can you speak to that and how we, how we respond to that, please?
It's a really important question, and I share everything you just said. And my first response to that is, when I teach about the rise of the Nazis, Most people, forget that Hitler comes to power really with a backdoor coup with a plot of conservatives who figure they can use him and get rid of him later. It's this conservative using of people for their own, agenda, for votes or whatever it might be, that's frightening, the frightening comparison here. And so when the conservatives basically did not disavow her, gave her power, this is incredibly dangerous. And I haven't got a direct answer to that. I don't know how to confront that, except, it's not going to work. We're not going to reach out to her and find out what the heck went wrong with her past, what is hanging out there. We just don't know, but something is hurting that woman. But it's going to be about, more than anything else, I think, working on the next election cycle to make sure those that supported this pay a price at the polls. I think it's the only way forward. And I think it's really important to speak to it in those terms. But I share, this is one of my great fears, that she has been brought into the political power base and been sanctioned. And that is huge warning signs for me.
Any other questions? So, as I said, I met Tom some years ago through AHO and have his contact information. So if you think of anything else or have other questions or comments or want more information from him, contact me and I will make sure he gets that information, those communications.
And Dan, you can share my email too, as well, if they want to contact me directly and save you a little bit of work. So if they want to do that, I have other materials I can send out as well. So whatever works for folks here.
Great. Thank you all for joining today. And Tom, thank you so much for your very thought-provoking and excellent presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for what you do and for being together today. Thank you.